I grew up way out in the country, the kind of place where you can walk half a mile in any direction before seeing another roofline. My parents' place sits right in the middle of a big stretch of land, a two-story farmhouse standing out among open fields and patches of brush. To the south, there's a peach orchard my mom still brags about. The west side is all open pasture broken up by the driveway that cuts through tall cottonwoods and old pecan trees. But the east and north edges of the property are nothing but dense woods that run for miles until you hit our nearest neighbors. By the time this happened, I'd just started working at a carpenter's shop in town. I had barely gotten my license, so having a dependable car wasn't really an option. I had that old '87 Chevy pickup that rattled in places I could never locate. The job didn't start until 10 in the morning because the owner preferred sleeping in, which I didn't mind in the summer. But winter meant leaving the shop around 9, and the drive home in that truck with fading headlights always made me tense. One night in late December, probably 10 or 11 years back, I ended up leaving even later than usual. I'd messed up a nightstand and stayed after everyone else to fix it before the customer showed up the next morning. By the time I shut down the shop, it was close to midnight. I was already annoyed with myself and ready to get home. Normally I'd take the highway back, but when I reached the turnoff, emergency lights were blocking the entrance. There'd been some kind of accident and nothing was getting through. So I turned around and took the long way, miles of back roads and dirt paths surrounded by thick brush and trees that swallowed whatever light my truck's high beams put out. Once I left the main road, this uneasy feeling settled in. One of those heavy, creeping sensations that builds slowly and doesn't let up. The farther I drove, the stronger it got. It felt like my brain kept telling me to quit being stubborn and just turn around, even if it meant waiting by the roadblock for who knows how long. I kept going anyway, telling myself that I'd driven this route 100 times, and it was always fine. I was about 10 miles from home when the road got rougher, roots and rocks pushing up in places where the dirt had washed away. I was easing through one of those stretches when the truck jolted hard, and I heard the unmistakable sound of a tire blowing. I wrestled with the wheel and got the truck settled on the shoulder. Mildly annoyed, but thinking it was just another late-night inconvenience, I hopped out and climbed into the bed to grab the spare. But the toolbox was open. Not just open, broken into. Every tool I owned, the spare tire, even the little survival kit I kept in there, gone. Whoever took it had stripped it completely. So there I was in the middle of nowhere, with no light, no phone signal, and nothing to fix the truck. The only useful thing I had left was the puukko knife my sister gave me before she moved to Finland. If I'd been thinking clearly, I would have stayed in the truck until morning. A neighbor always passed that road around 8, and he would have driven me home without a second thought. But for whatever reason, tiredness, frustration, or just plain bad judgment, I decided I could walk the rest of the way. I locked the truck, slung my rucksack over my shoulder, and started down the road. I hadn't made it far when the feeling returned. Stronger this time. It felt like something was pacing me, staying just out of sight. Every so often I'd hear movement in the brush, soft rustling at first, then heavier, like something was keeping up with my steps. I turned once to check, but the road behind me was empty. Eventually the trees opened into a small clearing, and that's where I heard him. "Hey there, boy." The way he said it stuck with me. The first part sounded almost calm, like he was trying to sound friendly, and then boy came sharp and loud, like he wanted it to hit me. I turned and saw him standing at the far end of the clearing. He was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, with a long coat hanging down to his knees and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. His hair was short and gray, and his eyes looked strange, like he was staring past me instead of at me. But the thing that made my chest tighten was the animal beside him. It looked like a huge black shepherd at first glance, but its build was wrong. Leaner, rougher, more like something halfway between a dog and a wolf. I couldn't move. I'd always thought that phrase was an exaggeration until that moment. My legs wouldn't respond. My hands wouldn't even clench. I just stood there, staring at this man and his animal. "What you doing out here, boy?" he said, taking a few steps closer. "Don't you want to talk to me, boy?" I managed to get my voice working enough to explain about the flat tire and the walk, though I'm sure none of it came out clearly. He kept coming toward me until he was close enough that I could smell him. Old cigarette smoke mixed with something I still can't place. His dog never looked away from me, like it was waiting for a cue. He took a slow breath, closing his eyes as if he was taking in the whole moment, then smiled. His mouth smiled anyway. His eyes didn't change at all. "Be careful out here, boy," he said. "There's a lot of dangerous things out here, boy." Then he stepped back into the brush and disappeared as quickly as he'd appeared. When I could finally move again, everything hit at once. My legs gave out and I dropped to the ground, shaking hard. It took a minute to gather myself enough to stand, and once I did, I ran. I didn't pace myself. I just pushed forward as fast as my legs would go. The woods felt endless, but the moment I saw the faint glow of our porch lights through the trees, something like actual relief hit me. That's when I heard it again. "Hey there, boy." It came from behind, far too close. I didn't turn around. I just kept running until I reached the edge of our yard, and the warm yellow light from the house fell over me. Only then did I look back. He was standing at the tree line like he'd been waiting there the whole time, the dog at his side, the same unsettling grin on his face. I got inside as fast as I could, locked the door and checked every window on my way up to my room. When I finally looked out across the yard, he was gone. The next morning, when my dad and I went to get the truck, I told him what happened. He said it was probably Samuel, some old hermit who lived deep in those woods. Dad had never met him, but he'd heard about him for years. I still don't know how someone could move through that brush so quietly, or how he managed to show up at the edge of our property like he'd followed me the entire way. And honestly, I don't think I want to know. I grew up in a small village about 25 minutes from the nearest city, the kind of place where everyone ends up knowing everyone else by name, and sometimes by reputation. It's quiet. It's surrounded by fields and old footpaths, and on most days it feels like the kind of place people wish they lived in. But the one thing that's always made life a bit awkward is the bus. It drops you off right in the middle of the village, but the last one leaves the city at 8. That's great if you're someone who likes being home early. But when you're 19 and still in that stage where nights out usually run longer than planned, 8 o'clock might as well be lunchtime. Back then, I spent a lot of time in the city, mostly because my friends lived there, but also because on some nights the casino felt like the easiest way to kill a few hours. On this particular night, I went alone and ended up losing everything I walked in with. It wasn't much, but it was enough to leave me with exactly one option for getting home: that late bus that drops you off near the woods. A cheap taxi was out of the question, and crashing at a friend's place wasn't happening either. The ride was quick, like always at that hour. There were only a couple of people on the upper deck, and I just sat there replaying a stupid blackjack hand in my head. By the time my stop was close, I was staring out the window and not really thinking about anything useful, so I ended up missing it by a few seconds. I hit the button and got out at the next shelter. It was cold in that way December gets when the rain has ruined the snow. Everything was damp and slushy. My shoes were already soaked, and stepping off the curb to grab a piece of trash blowing down the road only made it worse. I stood there thinking about my options. If I walked back toward the last stop, it was a half hour of bright pavement and open road. If I cut through the woods, I'd shave 15 minutes off. It would be darker, muddier, and definitely not the scenic route. But at that point I figured I was already cold and it wouldn't matter. I should have gone the long way. I'd taken that cut dozens of times, but always in daylight. It starts with a narrow path boxed in by fences. On one side you've got the fields belonging to the leisure center. On the other side there's a warehouse yard, with those tall metal fences that look like they'd slice your jacket open if you brushed against them. Then you pass under the railway bridge, and after that it all opens up into a rough spread of mud and weeds everyone just calls the wasteland. Up to that point, everything felt familiar enough. Creepy, sure, but predictable. The glow from the factory yard lights carried part of the way, so I could at least see where my feet were landing. My music was still playing quietly until I stepped out into the wasteland and realized how dark it actually was. That's when I took the headphones out and let the silence settle in. The ground out there is chewed up from quad bikes, and the rain had turned it into long, shallow pools that reflected nothing. The factory ahead of me looked either shut down for the night or completely abandoned, hard to tell which, and old rusted car shells sat around the place like forgotten props. To my left was a small patch of trees. To my right, the bigger woods started. It was all shadow and uneven ground, and I felt myself slow down without meaning to. That's when the feeling hit me. Nothing dramatic, just this quiet sense that something wasn't right. It wasn't even about seeing anything. It was more like the air changed behind me, and my body noticed before my brain did. I kept walking, trying to convince myself it was just the dark playing tricks. But after a minute or two, I caught myself listening too hard for footsteps that weren't there. I thought about turning back. If I did, I could be out of that place in a couple of minutes. But then another thought slipped in. If someone did come in behind me after I started, I wouldn't see them. It felt safer to keep moving than to stand still debating it. I reached the stretch between the big woods and the factory fence. That has always been the worst part. The mud and water made it hard to walk without slipping, and I kept my hand against the rusted metal panels to stay straight, making sure I didn't lift my arm too high near the barbed wire above. The woods beside me were pitch black. The trees were bare and close together, and even glancing in made me feel like I was looking into something that didn't want to be looked at. I sped up. Right as I settled into a faster pace, my foot caught something solid, and I went down hard. Luckily not into a puddle, but it jolted me enough that I took a second before getting up. That's when I heard it. Branches shifting, something heavy pressing through fallen leaves and sticks. Not a squirrel, not a fox. Something with real weight behind it. 3 quick sounds. Snap, snap, crunch. I spun around fast, and he was already stepping out from the tree line. He paused like he was checking behind himself, then turned toward me. He was about 15 feet away. Tall, broad, long hair hanging forward, so I couldn't tell if he was looking directly at me or at the ground. Everything about him was still. No talking, no shifting, no hesitation. Just standing there in the path like he'd been waiting for the right moment. My whole body tightened up. I tried to speak, to sound normal, maybe ask if he needed something, but all that came out was a strained noise I didn't even recognize. He didn't respond. He just watched me, or at least he seemed to. Then he took a step toward me. Slow, steady, purposeful. That was all it took. I turned and ran. No plan, no second thoughts, just the fastest I've ever moved in my life. I could hear him behind me, not far, pushing through the waterlogged ground with heavy steps. I kept imagining a hand on my back or fingers closing around my jacket, but I didn't stop. I ran until the path opened up, ran through the park, ran up the hill and into the housing estate, pulling my keys out with shaking hands. I didn't look back until I was inside, and the door was locked. I never saw him again. I don't know how long he chased me, or how close he came, or if he followed me out of the woods. I don't know what he wanted, and honestly, I'm fine never knowing. It happened a few years ago, back when my daughter was still tiny and slept in a bassinet next to my bed. My ex-husband was working nights at the time, so it was just the two of us in that old house. My bedroom was upstairs, and the rest of the place always felt a little too quiet when he wasn't home. Around midnight, my daughter woke for a bottle. Once she settled back down, I stayed awake scrolling on my phone to try and drift off again. While I was mindlessly scrolling through Facebook, I started seeing posts from people in nearby towns talking about a man who had killed someone and was running from the police. I normally ignore random posts unless they link to something real, but then I found an actual article about it. It said he'd killed someone in the next town over, and that police were warning people to stay inside, lock their doors, and expect possible phone alerts. Where I lived, that kind of thing almost never happened. Seeing it suddenly pop up everywhere definitely put me on edge. I texted my ex-husband at work. He wasn't convinced it was as serious as it sounded, but he told me to put on the police scanner app just in case. I left it running beside me and must have fallen asleep without realizing it. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up again, but when I did, the scanner was suddenly blaring with officers yelling over each other. I heard shots fired, and for a second I couldn't tell what was coming from the phone and what was happening outside my window. Then the gunfire started, loud and sharp, close enough that it sounded like it was right in the street. I froze for a second, trying to process what I was hearing. Once it clicked, I grabbed my daughter and headed for the hallway where there were no windows. Everything felt dreamlike and off balance as I moved. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone when I tried calling my ex-husband. He still didn't fully understand what was happening, so I hung up and called my mom next. I just needed someone to be on the phone with me, so I wasn't standing there in silence with my heart racing and gunshots going off outside. My daughter somehow slept through the whole thing. I stayed on the floor of the hallway with her, just holding her and trying to listen to anything on the scanner that made sense. At some point, I must have put the phone down without realizing it. Eventually it rang again. It was my mom. I thought she was just calling to check on me, but she was already on my road. The police had blocked it off, but she told them she was coming to my house, and they let her through. When she got to my front porch, we saw muddy footprints leading right up the steps and smeared across the door, like someone had kicked it or tried to yank it. I started wondering if that was the noise that originally woke me up. By then it was about 5 a.m, still pitch black outside. My mom and I sat in the kitchen with the lights on, drinking coffee and passing my daughter back and forth. My ex-husband showed up a little later, and when he saw all the police cars and the roadblock, he finally understood it wasn't just panic on my part. The whole story came out later. The man had killed someone in the next town over, only a few minutes from me, then ended up cutting through the woods behind my house. He killed another person in the house behind mine, and that's when the police surrounded the area. He started firing at them, which was the gunfire I heard. They shot him, and he died in the little strip of woods behind my backyard. The idea that all of that happened while I was lying in bed with my daughter still makes my stomach sink when I think about it. Once everything settled down and the sun started to rise, I stepped out on the back porch with a cigarette. The police lights cast this weird glow over the snow and the bare trees, and the whole scene looked unreal after the chaos of the night. Later that afternoon, I had several news reporters messaging me non-stop, wanting me to talk on camera about everything I saw and heard. I said I didn't mind telling them the story, but I didn't want to be filmed, especially not with my daughter, who I was still holding most of the day since I hadn't slept. They pushed back and even asked if they could show up at my workplace. I ended up blocking them all because it turned into a hassle really fast. It's still one of the most unsettling nights I've ever had, and I think about it every time I hear sirens late at night, or wake up randomly for no reason. It made me a lot more aware of how quickly things can happen right outside your own walls without any warning. I'd been living in Switzerland since August 2020, in a small mountain village that's so quiet you can sometimes go an entire afternoon without seeing a single person walk by. Before that, I lived in France, so the silence here took some getting used to. My house sits on the very edge of the village near the forest, and the closest neighbors are about 300 meters away. It can be peaceful, but it also means that when you're alone, you're really alone. On December 15th, my parents were away in France for work, and my sister lives about 10 kilometers down the road, so the house was completely mine for the night. I actually liked the idea of being alone for once. I could play video games with my friends for as long as I wanted, without worrying about waking anyone. Around 2 a.m, I finally started feeling tired and logged off. I headed upstairs, planning to take a shower and get to bed. The bathroom is right next to my bedroom, and everything felt normal as I turned on the water, washed up, and started brushing my teeth. I wasn't expecting anything unusual until I heard the sound of something shattering downstairs. It wasn't a vague noise either. It sounded like a glass or a plate hitting the floor and breaking. I froze where I was, toothbrush in hand, trying to convince myself it might have been something falling from a shelf or a dish I forgot near the edge of the counter. I waited at the top of the stairs for maybe half a minute, listening carefully. Nothing else followed. I finally made myself go down the stairs to at least check. When I reached the kitchen, there really was a broken glass on the floor. It wasn't near the edge of anything, and I couldn't figure out how it had fallen. No windows were open, no pets, nothing that made sense. I cleaned up a bit and went back upstairs to finish brushing my teeth. I'd barely been in the bathroom for 3 minutes when another sound came. This time not glass or movement, but the voice of a man speaking normally. This one didn't leave room for any logical explanation. I locked the bathroom door and turned off the light. I didn't move. I just listened. The voice was coming from the kitchen. At first, it sounded like he was talking on the phone. Then his tone changed, sharper, louder, like he was suddenly arguing with someone. That was the moment I knew whoever was in my house wasn't here by accident. My phone was in my bedroom, just a few steps away across the hallway. If he stayed downstairs, I could have made a quick run for it and called the police. But then I heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs. He was coming up. I lay flat on the bathroom floor, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps stopped right outside the bathroom door. I could see the faint shadow of movement under the small gap near the floor. He bent down and looked through the keyhole. When he spoke through it, his voice was calm, almost casual. "Is someone in there?" I didn't move. I didn't breathe. A second later, he suddenly shouted, "I know someone is in this house." And then he burst out laughing. The sound of it echoed strangely in the hallway. I didn't have many choices left. Staying silent wasn't helping, and there was no chance I'd be able to run past him. So I tried something that felt stupid, but was all I had. I yelled as loudly as I could, "The police will be here in 2 minutes." There was silence, sharp and immediate, followed by quick footsteps moving away from the door. I didn't hear anything else after that. I waited in the dark bathroom for what felt like forever, but was probably around 10 minutes before I finally got up, unlocked the door, and slipped into my bedroom to grab my phone. I called the emergency number right away. The police arrived quickly and searched the entire house and the area around it. They didn't find the man, but they did find a bag in the garden. Inside were a few random items: glue, a flashlight, cigarettes, and a Swiss knife. Nothing that explained why he was there or what he planned to do. I called my parents and told them everything. They canceled their plans and drove back the next day. To this day, we still don't know how he got into the house. And I still think about the moment he looked through that keyhole. I ended up taking my uncle's offer to move out to Colorado because, honestly, nothing about my life in Southern California made sense anymore. I was 21, barely scraping by on minimum wage in a neighborhood where people drove cars worth more than everything I owned combined. My roommates had just announced they were moving to New York. My mom had already left for Las Vegas, and I didn't have a strong enough reason to stay put. The idea of hitting reset somewhere quieter sounded like the only reasonable thing left. The only real problem was my car. I'd driven it until it practically fell apart, and at that point the engine was hanging on by a thread. I'd blown the head gasket months earlier and couldn't afford the repairs, so it slowly ruined itself every time I tried to keep it alive. I finally accepted that it was done. I put up a listing basically asking for whatever someone was willing to give, and a guy from a business that bought dead cars messaged me right away. We agreed he'd come by my apartment complex to take a look. It was winter, so by the time he showed up in this SUV, the sun was already gone, and the air had that sharp cold that hits as soon as the light fades. He stepped out, speaking with a heavy accent. Middle Eastern, if I had to guess. I walked him over to my car and tried to start it, mostly just for show. It would turn over, shake like it was about to give up entirely, and then shut itself off, exactly like I warned him it would. He barely hid his annoyance when I mentioned the $400 asking price. Instead, he offered me $150 and didn't budge. Since I was leaving in a couple days and honestly just needed the thing gone, I agreed. While he pulled out paperwork, he kept glancing at me and telling me I should sit in his SUV to warm up. I declined at first, but he kept repeating it, even reaching out slightly like he was trying to guide me toward the open door. I didn't want to make a big scene, so I kind of perched on the edge of the seat, just enough to humor him, but still in a position where I could step out quickly. Something about the way he was pushing it didn't sit right with me. He then got into the driver's seat, and I stepped back out immediately. That's when he told me he hadn't brought the cash and would need to drive to an ATM. Then he said I should go with him. That stopped me in my tracks. I told him it wasn't necessary, that he had to come back to get the car anyway, so he could grab the money alone and return. He kept trying to come up with reasons why I should ride along, but I cut him off by saying I had dinner on the stove and didn't want to burn it. That finally ended the conversation, and he left. By the time I got back inside my apartment, I realized my hands were shaking a little. I grabbed my phone and went out onto my balcony so I'd see him the second he pulled back in. He wasn't gone long, maybe 15 minutes. When he returned, I went downstairs again. He handed me the money, which was the exact $150 we agreed on. But it was a single $100 bill and a $50. Not exactly ATM cash. That pretty much confirmed what I'd been sensing the whole time, that something was off, even if I couldn't pinpoint exactly what he was trying to do. I was just grateful I hadn't gone with him or sat fully inside the SUV. My instincts, for once, had actually kicked in at the right time. I live in Minnesota, and for whatever reason I still think about something that happened a little over a year ago, sometime in that stretch between late December and the end of February, when it always feels dark outside. My mom and sister were hanging out in the living room, and I had just come downstairs to grab something when the doorbell rang. It wasn't unusual for people to come by selling things or dropping off flyers, so I didn't think much of it until I opened the door and saw two men standing there. Both of them were dressed in these old-fashioned black pea coats, the kind that looked like they were pulled out of a thrift shop from another decade. One of the men was heavy-set and nearly bald, holding an old black Bible that looked like it had been handled 1,000 times. The other one, who clearly seemed to be the one leading whatever this was thinner, with really light blonde hair and a face that looked worn in a way that made it hard to read. His eyes were such a pale blue that they almost looked gray in certain light. And when he stared at me, it felt like he wasn't actually looking at me, just through me. He started talking immediately. Not the usual introduction, not a mention of a church or a group, nothing about pamphlets or community outreach. He just launched into this long stream of religious talk about the meek inheriting the earth, and who knows what else. Normally I can tune that stuff out and wait for a pause to politely decline, but he didn't leave a single moment for me to speak. It was like he wasn't even trying to recruit anyone, just talking at me, watching the way I reacted. At first I just thought he was intense or socially awkward, but then I looked him in the eyes again, and something hit me so hard I had to force myself not to step back. His eyes didn't have anything behind them, not sadness, not anger, not excitement, just a flat nothing, like looking at a photograph instead of a real person. And the longer he kept talking, the more this quiet sense of alarm built in me, like my body was recognizing something before my brain caught up. My mom later told me I still looked normal on the outside, nodding and responding like anyone would during an awkward doorstep conversation. But I don't remember doing any of that. My mind felt like it had gotten stuck somewhere deep and separate, and even though I wanted to end the conversation and close the door, I couldn't make myself move. It was like being awake inside a dream where your limbs don't listen to you. The second man, the one holding the Bible, didn't say a single word. He just kept flipping through pages slowly, not following along with anything being said, almost like he was just waiting for the blonde one to finish whatever he was doing. The whole thing went on long enough that I started feeling lightheaded, and then suddenly it was over. He wrapped up whatever he was saying. I muttered a goodbye, and I closed the door. The moment it latched, I finally felt like myself again. My hands were shaking, and my mom looked at me with the same expression I was feeling, uneasy, confused, and trying to understand what exactly had just happened. She told me she'd been listening from the living room and had the same reaction when she saw his face through the doorway. She said she almost called me into the room just to get me away from him, but something told her it would be a bad idea to give him my name. I still don't know who those men were or what they actually wanted. I've had evangelists come to the house before and after that, and none of them felt anything like these two.